Hello, in this tutorial I'll be showing you how to make a spline mesh generator in Blueprints in Unreal Engine 4. At the end of this tutorial you'll have a spline mesh generator here, which you can drag out and it will procedurally generate a mesh along a spline, including a designated start and end mesh. It's all nice and parameterized too, so really easy to reuse. A key feature of this system is that it won't spawn a new mesh until it has enough room along the spline. It means you get very minimal stretching, and most of your bending of textures and that sort of distortion is going to happen on your bends, so it really keeps it nice and uniform, so you don't have to do too much extra to get to look nice. I'm making this in Unreal Engine 4.25, but I've made systems similar to this since 4.20, and you should be okay to use earlier versions. There will be one node that'll give you some issues, however we'll cover that when we get to it. Before you start, you'll need two things. You're going to need a middle mesh, ideally aligned along the x-axis, which is what I'm using for my demo. However, if it's along the y, that's okay. You should be able to work that out. You're going to need to know the length along that axis that it's aligned to. The axis, that the mesh is going to draw out along the spline that's going to conform to the spline. Mine's 100 units, but I'd recommend probably checking it within your 3D program. Also, with that mesh, the more divisions you have in your mesh, the better it's going to be able to curve. If you start to have fewer divisions than this, you're going to start to see some really hard edges, so keep that in mind with your mesh. You're also going to need a mesh to pop at the end. Mine does link up seamlessly, but it doesn't have to at all. You can put anything at the end of your spline, or you can have none. The system is highly parameterized as well, so very easy to change. I hope that you enjoy this tutorial. Let me know in the comment section if you have any questions or if there's anything you'd like to know more about, and I also hope that you learn a little bit more about splines and blueprinting. Let's get started. Alright, let's get started. So we're going to add a new blueprint class. It's going to be an actor, and of course BP underscore spline mesh generator. I'm going to double click and open that one up. Now in our viewport here, we're just going to add one component. It's just going to be our spline, and that's all for there. Now we're going to head over to our construction script. Now instead of doing everything out here, that's going to be a lot and it's going to be very busy. We're going to make three functions. One for our middle mesh, which is the meshes that are going to add along and conform to the spline, and then we're going to have a function for our beginning and our end mesh. So we're going to start with the middle mesh because that's the most important one, and we need information from those middle meshes to add our beginning and our end meshes. So add a new function here, and of course middle mesh setup, and this is that blank function here. So to start with, we're going to need to set our section length. So we're going to add a new variable. It's going to be called section length. It's going to be a float. Compile over here. Now instead of just having this set to what we know our section length is, that's the one I explained before, that's your length along the x-axis in my example, we're going to need this to be able to scale with our actor, so if we scale it within the world. So we're going to set it. Now, instead of just setting this to be our 100 units, which is what mine is, we're going to get the actor scale 3D. Just going to right click and split. Get our x, because that's the axis that our mesh is aligned upon, multiply by float. Mine's 100. If you're going to be using lots of ones with different scales, you might want to have this as a variable, and then we're going to use this to set up our section length. Alrighty, so now we're going to set up our for loop, which is going to add the spline meshes along the spline. Just going to drag off here, go to a for loop. Okay, so to calculate our last index, we're going to need to get the length of our spline and then see how many of these section lengths we can fit in there. So we're going to get our spline. We're going to get the spline length. There it is. We're going to divide it by our section length over here. We're going to truncate it, so that rounds it down. And then we're going to -1 because our first index is 0. Just highlight these here, just tap Q, that'll align them, keep it nice and easy, always clean up as you go. Okay, so now we're going to want to add our spline mesh component here, And instead of setting up our defaults like our mesh and our material through here, we're going to do this all through nodes in our function. That's going to make it much more customizable and easier, and we're also going to use it to get this information here so that our mesh conforms on the spline. Now, for each of our spline meshes, we're going to want to actually add them to an array so that we can reference them later on when we're adding our beginning and our end meshes. So we're going to want to add a new variable, and we're going to call this middle spline meshes. Let's call it spline meshes. Doesn't really matter. And its type is going to be a spline mesh spline mesh component, and it's going to be an array. And for each of these ones, we're going to want to add it to the array. Now, instead of just adding it for safety, we're going to want to set an array element, and that's going to guarantee that the element along here, that they're in the correct order. And we're also going to want a size to fit, so that's automatically going to adjust the size of our array to match how many elements we have in it. Also at the beginning, before we do any of this, we're going to need to clear our array. That's so we don't end up with blank references or references in the wrong order. Alright, so that's just the housekeeping taken care of. This will make a little bit more sense when we do our beginning and our end mesh functions. So now we're going to want to set what static mesh we're using. Instead of just setting that here, going to promote this to a variable. Whoops, not a local variable. Promote to variable. I'm going to call this middle mesh. Compile so I can get the default, and I'm going to set this to my middle. We're also going to set the material. These are all going to be exposed. Now my mesh only has one element, so I only need to do this once. If you have more, you're either going to need to do multiple of these, or you're going to need to set up your own loop, but I'm not going to cover that in this tutorial. So I'm also going to promote this to a variable, middle mesh material, pile, and my default is going to be red. Right, so these are just our aesthetics here. We're going to want to have both of these exposed, so we can edit it per instance in the editor. You can click the eye to open it here, or also you can have instance editable up here. Okay, so now we're going to want to set our forward axis. It does default to X, which does match up with mine, but I did just want to show you if your mesh is aligned on the Y axis instead, then you're going to need to set that there. Also, this axis here needs to match up with what you've got here, and if you may be going between X and Y, then you may need to parameterize this. Right, so once we've set our forward axis, we're going to attach to. Now, thankfully I'm in version 4.25, which means I have this very well named attach component to component. If you're in a version before that, you're going to have attach actor to component, but you're going to have it twice. You're going to need the one that when you click on it, it'll have target is scene component or something similar. If you can't work it out, just get both and then use the one that will let you add your spline mesh component as the target and your spline itself as the parent. There we go. Alright, and now the last step is set, start, and end. So we're going to need to set where the start and end position is along the spline, and that's going to get our mesh to curve and conform along the spline. So, we need to get our start position, our start tangent, and the end position and the end tangent. So what we're going to do is we're going to get this, whoops, not going to do it here, we're going to go here, get spline, we're going to want to get location at distance along spline, because we're only doing this once we have enough distance left, and then we're also going to do get tangent at distance along spline. There we go. Now to work out how far we are along, we're going to want to get the index here, and we're going to multiply that by our section length. Just plug this all in here. So that's our start location, or start position, and our start tangent. Just going to duplicate these, Control W, and for the end, Going to get our index +1, and if I just duplicate this down here, times that by our section length, it's going to be our end location and our end tangent and the spline here. Plug these ones in. Okay, so that is our middle mesh setup function. Okay, so now we just need to work on construction. So we're going to go over to our construction script, get our middle mesh function, and plug it in, and compile save. Now, it's always a good idea to test as you go, particularly when you've done such a major setup. So let's drag it out into the world. And just a quick overview for your spline, you can see the points here. If I just select the point here, and I have no keys held down, I can move it out, and whoops, move it, there we go, left and right, and I can also rotate. I can also use these handles here to adjust the tangents. And if I have a point selected and I hit Alt, hold down Alt, sorry, and drag, it's going to allow me to drag out a new point, so I can keep adding new points. And the more points, it's going to be more accurate. There we go. So it looks like it's working. We're not adding a extra mesh until we have enough room, which is what we want. Always test, even in a tutorial, you can always it's very easy to just miss a little tick box or not plug something in, so it's always good to test as you go, particularly with this is the most important part of our function. And over here we have our mesh. Let's just check that our parameters are working. Yep, I changed it. And if yep, I changed it and it works there. Awesome. Okay, so let's go back into our blueprint. Now we're going to need to do our start and our end mesh setup. We're going to start with the start function because it's a little bit more simple. So let's go here, add new function, start mesh setup. Now to start here, we're going to add a static mesh component, just a static mesh component, not a spline mesh component. However, like before, we could do all this stuff over here, set the static mesh, etc. However, that's not going to be very easy to change, and we want this to be easily customizable. So I'm going to drag out of here. We're going to set the static mesh. Promote this to a variable. We're going to call this start mesh. Whoops. And I'm just going to set my default here. I'm using the same mesh for my start and end, but you can use different ones, of course. I'm going to go set material. Same deal here, I only have one element index, so nice and simple here. Promote to a variable. Start mesh material. Compile so I can get my default, and I'm going to make this blue. So now we're going to want to attach it. Same thing like I said before, I have attached component to component, which is the better named one here. Get our spline. Now we need to set the location, and so we're going to want to set the relative location and rotation. You can do this in one node or you can do it in two separate nodes, but why do something twice when you can do it once? Now what we're going to want to do is get our first spline mesh from our array. We're going to get its start location and its start rotation, or start tangent. We're going to use that to work out where this mesh needs to go. So we're going to get our array of the spline meshes. Just going to get a copy. It's already at the first index, which is 0. We're going to get the start position. And that's nice and easy. We can just put that one straight into the location there. And then we're going to want to get the start tangent. Now the start tangent is not a rotator. However, we can convert it into a rotator. If we plug it in here, it'll actually give us the correct node. It's called rotation from X vector. However, the rotation from X vector doesn't account for roll. So we're also going to go off here and go get start roll. Just unplug this one here. Alt click was what I did there. Split this out. And what we're going to do is we're going to go make a rotator. So we're still going to use our Y and we're still going to use our Z. But for our roll, we're going to get the roll from there. And we also need to have the ability to manually adjust our start mesh's rotation. For example, if your mesh didn't have the correct orientation in the first place, or if you want to add an offset. So we're going to combine this with another rotator, and we're going to make a parameter for that. So if I add a new variable over here, I'm going to call it start mesh rotation, and it's going to be a rotator. Just get this here. That's going to combine these two together, and that's going to be our rotation. Alright, so we're just going to make all of these instanced editable, and that's our setup there. So back into our construction script, drag out our start mesh setup and plug it in. Now, the start mesh setup has to happen after the middle mesh setup because we're getting information that we're setting up in here. If we did this before, then the information won't be accurate. So once that's all plugged in, compile, save, and test. So there we go, I have my start mesh there. Let's just make sure that it does its job. We're moving it around. There we go. Just see if I can click on that very first one there. It's always very hard to get that, click on that first spline point. There we go. Rotating it, bring it up and down. Awesome. And it's doing what we told. And then we're just checking our parameters here. Yep, makes it look different. Yep. And then our extra rotation here, just checking that this works. I don't need that for this one, but better to cover all our bases. Alright. Alright, and now for the last function, our end mesh function. Let's go back in here, add a new function. Of course, end mesh setup. So this is going to be a little bit similar to our start mesh setup. Just going to add a static mesh component. Going to set up our static mesh. Right to a variable, call this end mesh. I'm using the same one as my start mesh. But here we go, set the material. Plug that one in here. Variable. All of this, by the way, you don't technically have to do. It'll work if you just program these in. But the idea of this is it's a time-saving system. So the more we expose, the more things we can do with it without having to go back. So this is going to let us sort of use this in as many situations as possible. So let's end mesh material. Spelling is very hard. And it's the same blue, I think. Alright, so we're going to want to attach. This one to our spline. Alright, so now we're going to need to do our set relative location and rotation. Just going to give myself some room here. Try and be as organized as possible. So I'm going to want to get my array of spline meshes and get a copy. I'm going to need to get the last mesh. So I want the last mesh spawned. So again, we're keeping this independent from the actual spline itself. We're going off the meshes that have been spawned. So I'm going to need to get the length. And just -1 because arrays start at 0. So that's going to get our last one there. We're going to need to get our end position, get our end tangent because we're getting the end of our last mesh in this one. We're also going to get the end roll. Get end roll. Alright. Position, again, that's nice and easy. It's our location there. Now, let's do our rotation. So we're going to get our rotation from X vector. Split this out. We're going to want to make a rotator. So our Z is going to go straight in here. Our pitch, we need to inverse that. So we're going to go multiply by -1. Not going to super go into why we have to do that. And our roll is going to come from here. from our get end roll. And then we're going to, same as our start mesh, we're going to combine rotators. We're going to add a new parameter. We're going to call this our end mesh rotation. I'm going to compile. Now I know that my start and my end mesh, because I'm using the same one, this one's going to be oriented the wrong way, so I'm going to, by default, have this rotated by 108 degrees. Get this here and plug it in. That's going to be our rotation. Just compile, save. I do that absolutely obsessively. That's okay. And then plug it into our construction script. Same deal. These two can really go in either order. However, they have to go after our middle mesh. Now, very important, compile save. Let's have a look. Alright, so our end mesh is already there. That was fast. I forgot to expose. Let's just quickly come back in. All of these instance editable. There we go. So let's just make sure it's doing the thing. There we go. It's attaching to our last one. It's moving up and down. It's moving left to right. There we go. Whoops. There we go, so we've now got our end mesh. Alright, so the last couple of things, we're just going to do some housekeeping, and we're also going to add the ability to not have these start and end meshes. Just going to come back in. Just going to start with our housekeeping. Just going to add a couple of return nodes. There's no real reason why we shouldn't work without these, but I think it's good practice. Just going to add our return node here. And our returns here. It's very rare that not having this will cause an issue, but I have experienced it, so I do it. Okay, there we go, and that's just where the function exits. Very important on a middle mesh that we do that once our for loop's completed. Alright, and now we're going to just tidy up our parameters a little bit here. So currently they're all under the one heading called default. We're going to have 3 different headings. So we're going to have this one here. Under category, we're going to call this middle mesh. And then we're going to use the drop down here. We're not going to drag because that can cause a little bit of a bug. Instead, we're going to use the drop down here to assign them to the category. Just going to do our start mesh. It just makes it nice and neat. It means if other people are using it, it's easier for them to understand. And also helps you out if you end up with lots of parameters. And our end mesh. Alright, these two can hang out because we're not using them in the editor. So the last thing we're going to do is just set up the ability to choose if we want to have a start and an end mesh. So we're going to add a branch here. Just hold down B and click. Plug that in. And this one is going to be add start. Whoops. Promote it to a variable first. Add start mesh. And if it is true, we're going to want to go into our start mesh setup. And we're going to have another branch here. And have both of these options end at this branch. And this one here is going to be a variable. It's going to be add end mesh. We don't need to do anything on our false. So we're going to have these both instance editable and put these into the correct categories. So that's in our start mesh, this is in our end mesh. Just going to move these up a little. Makes a bit more sense to have this here because if we don't do it, then we don't need to do anything else under. And both these default to true. Right, now we've done our cleanup. Let's just go back into the editor. Nothing looks like it's changed. Let's just check that our extra functions work. So there we go. And there's our end mesh. Just make sure quickly that when we update stuff, it's not breaking anything. Awesome. Right, there we go. So that's it for this tutorial. I hope this has helped you out and that now you have a nice functioning spline mesh generator that's going to save you some time. Let me know if you have any questions or anything you'd like me to try and explain a little bit more. And enjoy, guys.